Hello, welcome to FX PhD. My name is Matt Leonard and this is class number 1 of our new Katana course. So I'm very excited to be able to bring this to you. It's been something that's been in the pipeline for probably 6 months now. So it's finally come to fruition, and it's great that you're going to be able to get this training. So a bit of a backstory just to start things off. I was asked to go to SIGGRAPH last year, and from SIGGRAPH I went on to Sony Picture Imageworks, where I had a week of pretty much one-to-one training by a guy over there called JC, who's one of their lead trainers in Katana. So it was a great experience. It was pretty hard at the beginning, to be honest. It took me at least a day and a half before my brain finally clicked with how Katana was working. And after that, it really just became a learning experience of adding new things to what I already understood about the software. And so what we're going to do this week is we're going to really go over what I learned in those first day and a half of being at Sony. And the reason why we're not diving straight into the software is because if you're like me, you've probably got a background with some 3D, you've probably got a background with some compositing, and therefore you probably, like I did, think, how hard can this be? And it actually isn't very hard to get your head around it. There's just a number of things that we need to understand right off the bat as to how Katana thinks and works. And then next week we're going to be diving straight into a mini project where we're going to basically build a Katana script start to finish. So at the end of week 2 you'll actually have a final Katana output, which you can then take into Nuke or Fusion or whatever you're using to composite, and know that you've actually achieved something, which is great. And then the rest of the course is going to just be building on what we've then learned, adding more and more tools. And believe me, there's a lot of stuff in Katana. If you were to ask me how big it is, I think it's bigger than Nuke, but it isn't as big as Maya. So somewhere between Nuke and Maya, that's how complex Katana is. So that gives you a bit of an idea as to kind of how big this is. And because of that, we're just going to be covering kind of a 101 level for this term. So first off, Katana and the VFX pipeline. What actually is Katana? And there's lots of things going around. You hear lots of kind of catchphrases, and one of the ones that banters around the Foundry quite often is Katana is more than a lighting tool. And it is. Katana is actually a look development and lighting tool. And the look development and lighting, in my mind and in how I was taught at Sony, are very much two distinct disciplines. So you'll have a look development team and you'll have a lighting team. Now, what do those mean? Look development basically is the process that you go through in order to make your asset, whether that be a character, a prop, an environment, look the way you want it to look for the entire show. So whether that's episodic TV, whether that's a feature film, whether it's kind of the video that goes in a game, whatever it might be being used for, it's getting that Smurf character or getting that Spider-Man New York City or whatever it may be. It's saying that I'm going to develop the look of that, and then that's fixed. Okay, so that's the first thing that Katana is used for. It's used for look development, and it's very, very good for that. Once that section is done and locked and signed off, you then have obviously all the shots in your film, in your TV series that are having CG added that then need to be actually lit. And so you then go into a process where you bring in your background plate, you bring in your CG that's been modeled and animated, and then you want to take the look development kind of look that you've created, so all the shaders and everything, you want to assign that to the geometry that is for that specific shot, and then you want to do the lighting for that specific shot. So Katana very much breaks down into these two areas. One team would use it for look development and kind of save what they've done, and then a second team, or it could potentially be the same team, same person, then uses that look development information to then light and add the shaders and textures to ongoing shots. Okay, so that's where Katana kind of fits, look development and lighting. Now, where does it fit into the overall VFX pipeline? So this diagram is obviously very simplified overview of a typical VFX pipeline. So at the top you've got things like the plate being scanned or digitized, or just the plate coming in, whether it's from film or from the Red or Alexa or whatever the plate is coming from, and that obviously then goes to match move and clean up and various things like that. You then have obviously people potentially writing shaders who, knowing that they need to create a certain texture for a certain type of skin or a building or a prop, they can get on and begin to write that shader. They don't necessarily need anything to do that. And then you obviously have the bulk of the 3D team which begin modeling the assets. Now once the asset has been modeled, it would then go to potentially a rigging department, and all the joints and the rigging setup is done, and then that would then go to animation, and also obviously match move data would be fed into animation as well. Now potentially for most studios this modeling, rigging, animating would all be done inside of something like Maya. Okay, now a company outside of a kind of Katana pipeline may then continue in Maya to do their general look development, their lighting, and their rendering. So basically everything stays inside of Maya unless it needs to get moved to effects, where it then may go to something like Houdini or Softimage Ice or whatever someone might be using for effects. And depending on what the effects are, they could obviously be brought back into Maya as some kind of Alembic cache and rendered, or you may find that because of the kind of volumetric effects you're doing, that you want to just render through RenderMan within Houdini, or just use Mantra, as many people do. But when you have Katana, that traditional setup is broken, and what happens is that the look development can begin very quickly, and it can begin even when the modeling is taking place, because you just need a general asset to begin with. So you have the modeling, you have the people writing shaders. Once the model is finished, or even before it's finished, that can be then sent into Katana, where the look development can happen. And the look development in Katana is very similar to the look development you may have done in some other program, in that you are basically applying shaders to the model in various ways, whether it's overall, per object, per face, using UV data, however you would want to do it. Now, instead of obviously going back into Maya once the look development's done and doing the lighting and the rendering, that all remains in Katana. So the look development team do their look dev on the models. The modeling team then pass off to rigging and animation. Animation animate the shot, and then they pass the animation that fits with the background plate back to the lighting Katana team. And the lighting Katana team bring in the animated cached Alembic file, or whatever they're using. Often it's Alembic for Katana, and they fit that cache data onto the background plate in a way that you would often normally do, just with the plate as a background behind the CG. And then you would use various types of lights inside Katana to do your full lighting setup, and that could be anything from a point light to a spotlight, directional light. You could use image-based lighting, whatever you want. Really, the world is open to you. Then once the lighting's done and the shot is finished and all the textures are assigned to that specific shot, you then render out of Katana, and the renders then obviously get passed to Nuke or After Effects, or wherever you're doing your final comping. So unlike a traditional pipeline where everything may stay in a 3D program until going out to compositing, modeling, rigging and animation is done in the normal way, and then that data is passed at various stages, either to look development after the modeling is complete, or once the animation is done, the background plate and the match move is then fed to Katana for lighting and rendering. Okay, so that's how Katana fits into the pipeline at the moment traditionally. Now, the question is probably being asked, well, who actually uses Katana? Well, Katana can be used for a mixture of different people. At the moment, it's generally being used for artists, which would be pretty much where I would fit into the process. It could be for more technical people, so technical directors, or it could be pipeline engineers, people that are actually writing a pipeline for their facility. Okay, So artists, technical directors, or pipeline engineers. That's the kind of person that's going to be using Katana. You're not seeing animators in there, you're not seeing riggers in there, because those people are not the kind of person that would be using Katana. That would usually be done inside of Houdini or Maya or Soft, whatever you're using. Now, what are the key aims of Katana? What is the point of Katana? Well, it has three main, or rather four main points: efficiency, scalability, flexibility, and artist control. So the efficiency is that you can quickly light and texture many shots. Once the look development is done, it's very easy to bring in more and more shots, or more animation setups that obviously make a shot, and reapply the look development data directly to those assets, light it, render it, and get it out the door. Then you bring in the next shot, you apply the look development information to those assets again that obviously has already been done, light it, render it, out the door. So it's very quick and very efficient to do lots and lots of shots. Now obviously in Maya that becomes more difficult, because you have your master file and then you're bringing it in and it may not be right, and you may have all types of issues in trying to merge lots of things together. Katana works, as you will see later as we get into it in more detail, in a very different way to anything that you potentially would have seen in Maya or Soft or Max, and it just is incredibly efficient. The other thing that makes Katana really interesting is its scalability. It can handle extremely complex size sets, models, and just a mass of geometry. So when we look at things like The Amazing Adventures of Spider-Man, you have the whole of New York, and all of that New York scene, pretty much all of it, can be loaded quite happily into Katana, and it doesn't phase Katana in any way. If I was doing that inside of Maya, once my RAM had maxed out, Maya would then pretty much blow up and crash. And so you then end up having to work with references, and it just becomes a nightmare. So Katana has this amazing ability to scale in the way that it handles assets and data information, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Then we have flexibility. Everything you need to do your look development and your lighting comes already in Katana. And one of the things that we need to talk about later on is that when it comes to lighting and materials and rendering, you have multiple choices as to how you do that with regards to what kind of renderer you're using. So Katana is kind of render agnostic. You can choose to some degree what render engine you're going to put in there, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And Katana also gives users the power to apply and use more general scene processing. So there's actually a 2D compositor built into Katana as well. Now, I don't think anyone wants us to ditch Nuke for 2D in Katana, but if you need to do slap comps, or you just need to use Katana to do some kind of more general 2D processes or scene processes overall, all the information is there. And not many people know that Katana actually started out as a 2D system, and then it evolved into the 3D system that it's now known for. So there is quite a strong 2D compositor built into Katana, which isn't a separate module, it's all just part of Katana. Okay. Then we have artist control, the final part. And like Nuke, like Houdini, it provides a non-linear and flexible method in order to work with your shots. So it's all node based, it's all non-destructive, which makes life, as we know for those people that use Nuke or Houdini, really nice to work with and very flexible. So the origins of Katana, if you hadn't heard, are from Sony Picture Imageworks. And it was first used on Spider-Man 3. Now, the other thing that is interesting, and I mentioned it just a moment ago, is the agnostic method in which Katana works with render engines. So at the moment, Katana works either out of the box with Solid Angle's Arnold or Pixar's RenderMan, and they are both supported really well. I've been using both of them with Katana for 6 months now, and they are pretty much seamless, just the same way that we'd be used to seeing Mental Ray inside of Maya. You don't really think of it as being a plugin, it's just part of the software, and that's the same as Arnold and RenderMan in Katana. Now there's also Chaos Group are developing a plugin for V-Ray for Katana. Now, that was announced earlier in 2012, but so far we haven't seen that come out to be able to buy. It may be out now, but I haven't seen it. And also there's the potential of putting NVIDIA's mental ray in there. But at the moment that's probably more customized as part of a company's workflow as opposed to being supported straight out of the box by the foundry. So back in 2004, this was the first image that came out of Katana. You can see it's kind of interesting. Katana has definitely come a long way. So this would have been the first image that anyone saw, and they were probably very pleased with that. That was then handed off to the team working on Spider-Man 3, and within just a few months they got this shot out, which I think was very exciting for the Katana team at Sony, but probably also a little bit scary as they were doing the kind of main feature film work with it when it was still very much in development stage. And from then it really just flourished into many other things. So Katana in films, where would we have seen it? Well, pretty much anything from Spider-Man 3 onwards coming out of Sony. So you've got some massive things in there: Speed Racer, I Am Legend, Watchmen, obviously a massive one. Then you've got some of the animated features, Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. Things like Hotel Transylvania is obviously another big one, along with Smurfs. But then you've also got other companies doing things like the end sequence in the garage of Mission Impossible 4, Ghost Protocol. Tippett Studio has been using it on Breaking Dawn Part 2. We've also seen Ted used on it, The Watch, and of course Sony are now working on The Great and Wonderful, the Oz film. So many films are using Katana, and as the client base grows, we're going to be finding that more things are coming out. Now obviously the client base has also grown. So originally it was just Sony, and then ILM had bought into it, Digital Domain, Tippett, MPC, Reliance, a whole bunch of companies here that you can see all over the world, from the States to Canada, India, into Europe, into the UK. So obviously you can imagine ILM are working on some amazing films at the moment. MPC are working on some amazing films. In fact, all of these companies are working on great material, and we're looking forward to seeing all that come out. And so as those films come in and we begin to watch them, we'll know that many of those have been using Katana for sections of the film or the entire film, depending on where these companies are in their testing and implementation of Katana into their pipelines. So lots of companies, and obviously this list is going to grow. It definitely feels that we're on the tipping point now of people moving across to Katana. So how does Katana actually work? Well, it's node based, or what Andy Lomas says as recipe based, and it's worth just saying lots of the information that I've got here and lots of the things I have learned over the last 6 months have not only come from JC at Sony, but also from Andy Lomas over at the Foundry, who's kind of the main Katana guy there. So a quick shout out to Andy, thanks for all his help. He constantly gets bombarded with questions from me. So recipe based or nodal based, depending on how you want to look at it. Very similar to Nuke, as we've said, similar to Houdini, in that it's a node-based approach, which is obviously a non-destructive, non-linear method of working. And a collection of nodes make up a script, or what you could define as a recipe. It's basically, if you can imagine what a Nuke script looks like, that's what we're working with. Okay, so it could be a recipe of nodes to make a final cake or a final product, or it could just be what you would call a script. Okay, however you want to look at it. But when you talk to people who are using Katana, you often hear this recipe phrase, so I just wanted to put that in there. But I'm probably going to talk about it mainly as a script at the beginning, because I think that's easier to understand. And the nodes that can be used in Katana to make our recipe or our script can be geometry, they can be things to make and assign materials, the ability to create lights, and then obviously things to do the rendering as well. And they're really just the top 4. There are hundreds of nodes inside of Katana that do all types of clever things, so this is by no way kind of a definitive list of what the nodes do in Katana, but so as not to panic anyone at this point, just imagine them as that way working. So what would a Katana script look like? So this is a very basic script, and when you first look at it you think Nuke, that's easy to get your head around, and that's a good way of thinking. It is easy once you understand how it's thinking. So at the top you can see that we have the ability to import geometry, and this can be imported in various ways. We also have the ability to import a camera, and that camera would obviously often be coming from the Matchmove department or coming out of Nuke, having been tracked there. And then you have the ability to create materials. Okay, so you literally are making all the materials that you need, the same way that you would create them in Maya with the hypershader. You would create them inside of Katana and just kind of have them stacked up ready to use. And then all of that information, the camera, the geometry, the materials, are all brought into the main scene, connected together with, surprisingly, a merge node. At that point, you've pretty much got everything in the script together as a lump, and you can then take the materials that you created earlier and you can assign them to the geometry in various ways. And some of the ways in which geometry and materials can be combined is extremely clever and adds some of the power to Katana. And once you get your head around how that works and we begin to talk about it more, you're going to be very excited, because things that would have potentially taken hours and hours and hours using a traditional 3D system like Maya or Houdini can be done extremely quickly and extremely interestingly inside a Katana. Then moving on, we create lights, and those lights are, again, can be any type of lights that you have available to you, and they are then merged into the scene as well. So now we have our geometry that is being looked at through a camera, we have materials assigned to that geometry, and now we have lights illuminating that geometry. The next thing that you would tend to do, after obviously doing other bits and pieces, is that you would assign a renderer and do the render settings. So you would say, I'm going to use Arnold for this shot, or I'm going to use RenderMan for this shot. You work out all the settings, how big you want the render to be, the anti-aliasing, etc., just like you would in Maya. And then the last thing you would do, or one of the last things you'd do, is actually render that information out as your OpenEXR or whatever format you're going with. So this would be a typical method in which Katana would work through a script. And this is kind of a mixture of look development and lighting piled into one. Once we get into doing lighting and look dev separately, this script is basically broken in half, and we have what's called a look file that stores the look development information, and then when you come to the lighting, you load that in and apply that to the geometry. But we'll get into that later. We don't want to get too confused at this point. So scalability. What makes Katana so powerful is its ability to basically deal with these huge data sets. And the thing that makes it very powerful is that it is a deferred processing system. Basically what that means is it only uses what it needs when it needs it. It doesn't do what something like Maya would do, is that you load everything in and it's all there, it's taking up all your resources, all your RAM, because it's a massive model. Katana doesn't work that way. Katana will only use what it needs. So as you can see in point 2, information is only loaded into RAM as required, and once the information isn't needed anymore, it's cleared out of RAM. So your RAM basically continually fluctuates in what's being used. So you could load in the entire city of New York in a method, as you can see in point 4, as a bounding box. And it's only as you then begin to drill down into that bounding box, saying open it in more and more detail, does the RAM begin to fill up. And this could just be one building or one part of a building that you're opening up and seeing the information on. And also, the renderer only processes what it needs, and that's pretty common for most renderers today. So let's just have a look in a little bit more detail at this method of working with bounding boxes and this deferred processing. So here I've given you 4 diagrams showing you 4 states of how Katana could be. The top left one simply shows all the geometry for this section of New York, or wherever the city is, loaded in and displayed as a bounding box. And the reason why we're seeing these bounding boxes is simply because the group of that particular building is shut down. So all we're seeing is the kind of the top level of that hierarchy closed. Now, as we begin to open up one building's hierarchy, so you're basically drilling down into that building, you can see that in the next picture, top right, we're now getting a lot more detail of that building. There still may be some bounding boxes in there of different parts. It could be air vents or door handles or things like that could still be in the bounding box stage just because we haven't opened those fully. But you can see at this point we're able to look at this building in a lot of detail so that we can do texturing on it properly or do whatever we need to do. The rest of New York is visible to us. We get an idea as to how the city layout is, but we're not having to put all that geometry into RAM and into our machines. And you can imagine if you were doing general lighting that even just the simple B-box method of seeing the buildings would probably be enough to get some form of lighting done. When you're adding just some major lights around the city, you don't need to see the door handles and the screws and the hinges. You can literally just work with this is a building in this position. So you often don't need to necessarily open everything up to its maximum capability to do many of the things that you need to in Katana. Then if we move to the bottom left-hand image, you can see that we're focusing on just this one top section of the roof, and it's been opened up to its full extent. And Katana gives you the ability to really drill down right down to the UV or vertex level. So you can really get right into the very guts of the model itself. And then the final image is really showing us all of the city loaded into RAM, loaded into Katana and fully opened. So you can see if you really want to go crazy, you can open everything up, but your machine is definitely going to be a little bit sluggish at that point unless you've got a beast of a machine. And even then, loading the whole of New York into the fastest machine on the planet is probably still going to be a little bit slow. So let's now look on at the look development and lighting parts. How do those work together? So look dev in Katana works through a number of processes. First of all, you'd import the hero assets, whether they be props, environments, characters, etc. Then you apply a basic lighting rig, either imported or you create one from scratch because you need to for that particular instance. And you basically set up basic lighting around the object. So that could be 3-point lighting or whatever you need just to illuminate it enough to see what you're doing with materials. Then you create your materials that can either be RenderMan materials, Arnold materials, whatever, and they are then applied to the object and assigned to that hero asset in a very similar way that you would in Maya or Soft or whatever you're using. Then for the interesting part, you then take your hero asset with all the materials assigned and you kind of standardize it or save it into what's called a look file bake. And what that does is it basically says this piece of texture, this piece of material is assigned to this part of the model. And it's very important that all your naming is right, and it's important that the model that you do your look dev on is the same model that you then take to do your animation later on. So we know if we were dealing with, say, a Smurf, that you've got the Smurf's, say, hat, the Smurf's iris, the Smurf's pupil, the Smurf's body, the Smurf's shoes, the Smurf's gloves, and the names are exactly the same for the models that you're animating as they are for the model that you've done the look dev on. This means that when you then bring in your new models that are already animated, the look file bake, when it reapplies the materials, it looks for the same name, finds the name, and knows how to apply the material. So you're going to find that as we get into Katana, we need to work very carefully with our naming conventions, and that's really coming out of your 3D program. So if you're one of these people that just make general stuff in 3D and it's left being called Polycube 1, Polycube 2, Polysphere, whatever, and you've taken those cubes and you've formed it into a beautiful car or whatever you're using, but it's still called P-Cube 600, you're going to find that when you bring that into Katana, you're going to have an absolute of a nightmare time using the power of Katana. So coming out of Maya, we're going to need to make sure that we are very, very organized and that everything is named correctly. And you'll know from my Nuke classes and my Maya classes that I love organization. So you will grow to love organization, or you will find that life becomes tricky. So that's the look dev side of Katana, basically. It gets more complicated, obviously. We then have lighting. Now the lighting works could be a direct follow-on from the look dev, could almost be part of the same script if you wanted, or as it's done in Sony and other places, it can be done by a completely different group of people using completely different scripts or recipes. So this works by you now load in your animated shot. So you have, for instance, if we're staying with the Smurf analogy, we have now Papa Smurf running across some other sets and interacting with Smurfette. All of that is brought in as various Alembic caches. Your camera is brought in, your background plate is brought in, and then you import the look file bake that we did in look development into the lighting setup, and that is then applied to the models. And you could obviously have different look file bake files for different assets, characters, environments. So you may have a number of those being applied back to different assets. Then you create the lights, and this lighting is the specific lighting for the shot. So if you have a window up above to the left, you need to obviously simulate that lighting. If you have the glow of a fire, that all needs to be done properly. If you have general HDR, that all needs to be done properly. And all of that is done inside of Katana using the information for lighting from whatever renderer you're using, RenderMan, Arnold, etc. Then you create your render passes, or import existing passes that you may have used for a previous show or previous shot, and those passes can be all the things we're used to. So it could be diffuse, spec, ambient occlusion, point position passes, UVs, etc. All those are set up like you would inside of Maya, etc., and then we render everything out, and those renders then go off to Nuke or whatever you're using. And it's worth noting that the number of shots require the same lighting setup, or the master lighting setup can be created by an artist and then used multiple times. So you can create a rig for a specific building or a specific scene that you may have different shots in, and then they can just be used over and over, which is obviously what you'd want and expect. So if we're looking at Arnold as the main renderer, we have a number of materials that can be used. So if you're used to using Arnold, all of that's available. Surface, bump displacements, you can do standard Arnold shaders, Lambert, hair, etc. If we're using RenderMan, again, we have out of the box a number of fantastic RenderMan shaders, fongs, blends, glass, plastic, metal, all the displacements, atmospheres, etc. But obviously with both RenderMan and Arnold, you can configure and build your own shaders that can then be brought into Katana later, okay, or whenever you need them. Same as with lights, Arnold has a number of lights, points, spots, sky domes, distance lights, etc. Same as with RenderMan, it has all its normal ones that you would have been used to if you've been using that with Maya. So ambient, point, spot, indirect, etc. Now, the material assignment can be done in different methods, and it's very, very interesting the way this works. So materials can be assigned to geometry based on the metadata information, and they can also be assigned based on the geometry name itself. So imagine you've worked hard in Maya to make sure everything is labeled correctly. So for a specific building, you have a whole bunch of pieces of geometry that are called glass, a whole bunch that you've got called door handles, a whole bunch of things that you have called brick, and then maybe some wood, which is for kind of window frames, door frames, etc. And that could either be part of the metadata itself of the Alembic file, or it could just be in the name of the geometry itself. So we haven't gone with Polycube 1 or 2, we've gone with glass, left, front, or whatever you're using. When you bring that model then into Katana, and you say you make a glass texture and you want to assign that glass texture, you can say assign the glass texture based on any piece of geometry in the scene which has glass in the name, or take this brick texture and assign any brick texture to anything that has brick in the metadata, or anything that has building side in the metadata. So you can see that it becomes very easy to then quickly assign things, and you can go even further than that, because you can then add variations into that itself. So you could have a door handle texture that has a specular highlight that is generated through some kind of fractal design, and that can be randomized across all the door handles in all of the doors and city in your scene as well. So you can end up quickly and easily applying textures to multiple things where you have mass variation. So you don't end up, as you would in Maya, having to make 2 or 3 or 4 different types of textures and then by hand apply those across lots of models. It can all be done very automated, and the variations can be done depending on how you want the scene to look. You can also use what are called collections, and collections are set up in Katana at the point in which you are kind of bringing in the geometry and splitting it out. So if you suddenly decide that you want to take a whole bunch of things that at the moment weren't really connected and put them into a collection so that you can assign one specific type of geometry to them or just light them in a certain way, that can be done as well. So collections are a great way of working as well. Now, we have some general rendering limitations, as you would expect. So specific lights and shaders are only available depending on what renderer you're using. So as it says, RenderMan shaders and lights only work with RenderMan, Arnold shaders and lights only work with Arnold. Probably don't have to tell you this, it's pretty obvious. Same as in Maya, if you make a RenderMan shader and then you try and render that with Mental Ray, it's not going to work. Same thing inside of Katana. So when you're looking at renderers and you're looking at Katana, you really need to decide which way you're going to go at the beginning. So some companies no doubt have said they're going to buy Katana and they're going to use Katana just with RenderMan, where other companies may buy Katana and say they're just going to use Katana with Arnold, which is the way Sony works. Sony only uses Arnold as its renderer. Or you could have lots of money and say I'm going to have both Arnold and renderer and use whichever renderer I need for whichever shot or whichever show it's best appropriated to. So that's up to you, but you're going to be limited to one or the other or both, and then you're going to need to just use those shaders or those lights with that particular render engine. So let's actually have a look at Katana. What does Katana look like? Well, this is my Katana layout, and believe me, it's shuffled around quite a lot over the time, and when I was at Sony, this is pretty much the layout they had. In fact, this is the exact layout they had, so I adopted that just because I was dealing with JC so much and it made it easier for both of us to work when we knew what we were looking at. But it is entirely customizable. Okay, so let's begin to break it down so you understand what everything's doing, because you're probably looking at this and thinking there are lots of windows and each window has quite a number of tabs in it, and believe me, all the tabs aren't open at the moment, so it does get more confusing if you want it to. But this layout, which I'm going to suggest you guys go with, is the layout which I find most useful, and it's the one I'm going to be using throughout the course. So at the top we have the general menu bar, and that contains all the normal things you'd expect: file, edit, help, plus some other bits and pieces. You then have some icons that you can see from that kind of cog that go across to the right, and they do various things such as enable you to use Python scripts. You can do things like get rid of the caching. You can do things like use interactive render filters, which are fantastic. So just talking about those briefly, imagine a situation where you've set up all of your render and you've got everything maxed out to what you need, and it's now taking an hour to render a scene, but you know that's how it needs to be. And then you need to go in and just do a bit more tweaking. So in Maya you'd have to now go back to your render settings, make some changes, drop everything down. It becomes a bit of a pain trying to remember how you had it set. Lower all your settings down, now your render takes place over a few minutes as opposed to an hour. In Katana it's much more simple. You literally have a render filter that you've preset up, and it literally says drop the anti-aliasing from 10 down to 1. And you take that render filter and you drop it into this particular menu. You hit render, and immediately as the render takes place, Katana or as it would be Arnold or RenderMan, says, hang on, I'm not doing this as a full anti-alias render, I'm doing it with a much lower one, and the render goes through super fast. The minute you've done it and you're happy with those changes, you literally remove the filter, hit render, and now you've got your full hour quality render back again. So there's lots of things like that that are very easy to use. You can kind of drop them in and out, do various things, and it makes life in Katana very straightforward. Okay, so that's your top menu bar. Get into all this later, don't worry about that. Then I have my node graph, which you can see at the top, and my other tabs are my curve editor and my dope sheet. So the node graph is obviously where we build everything, and you can see just from what you've got in front of you there that it's very similar to Nuke in that you have backdrops, you have nodes with lines coming out of them that can be connected together. You can also have notes and various other things. Okay, you also have a curve editor, as I've said, and a dope sheet that you can use for doing all your animation as you go through. Let's jump across now to the right, and on the right I have my parameters and my catalog section. Now my parameters are where you adjust everything in the scene. So this is kind of, if you're coming from a Maya point of view, this is your attribute editor, or if you're coming from a Nuke point of view, this is your properties panel. Okay, this is where we do all of the work. So when we select a tool, this is where we get the gubbins that enable us to edit that and adjust it. Underneath that, as a closed tab, is the catalog, and the catalog basically keeps a record of all the things that you have rendered. So just like in Maya, we can actually do a render and then save that render. In Katana, those renders are saved automatically, which makes it very easy to go back and compare what we did an hour ago to what we just rendered a few moments ago. Okay, so that's your catalog. Moving down now to the bottom left-hand part of my interface, I have my scene graph, and then my closed tabs are my project settings and my Python section. Now the scene graph you can think of more as your outliner from Maya. This is where you kind of get a hierarchical view of all of your scene, and this is where, as you begin to open up this hierarchy, more and more information is shown to you as opposed to being concealed as a bounding box. Okay, so that's your scene graph. Works in a very similar way to Maya, and you can see that you've got lots of information telling you the type of information it is. So is it a group, is it a polymesh, what actually are you looking at, along with what kind of materials and lights are working with that. Okay, you then have your general project settings, which, as you can imagine, are just the parameters of the whole project, and then you have a Python section where you can actually enter Python commands and do various things, like look at the outputs of that Python script, etc. Moving across, we then come to our viewer, and the viewer is where we view and manipulate all of the 3D information. So coming from obviously a Maya or Houdini background, soft background, this is your 3D view where you're doing most of the work, though in Katana you don't do most of the work here. This is simply the way in which you will interact with your model, put lights in the right place, select things based on the visual representation as opposed to it in a list, and do those kind of things. Okay, so that's your viewer, always being used, but you're doing much more in the node graph area than you are in this, which is obviously different to how something like Maya works. You then have render logs under there as well, and that obviously gives you a full output information on what the render has been doing. And then you also have attributes, and the attributes are really interesting. We will definitely be getting into those in more detail later on in the course, but the attributes basically hold the values of each individual part of the script or what you're doing from the scene graph. So as you do things, as you assign materials, as you apply lights, as you manipulate different parts of your models, the attribute area tells you what's going on. So if you're like, is this light illuminating this piece of geometry, or has this texture been assigned to this area of the scene yet? The attribute area is where you go and have a look, and it will tell you whether that's done or not. If we then go across a bit further, we come to our monitor, and the monitor is literally kind of the render view from Maya. This is where you actually see what the image looks like for real in all its glory at the render stage. And then finally at the bottom we have the timeline, and this enables us to move around in Katana in time and do various things with keyframes, etc. Now, as I said, Katana is completely customizable, so this is one possible layout you could have of Katana. So you can see new things that are being shown here are the render controls and also the render log. And then another layout here where we've got much larger monitor being shown. At the bottom you also have the curve editor being shown, and then at the top on the right you have the catalog, and the catalog only has one item in at the moment, which was the beach shack that I rendered, but you can see it tells you what frame I rendered, how long it took to render, when I started, and other bits and pieces. So there's lots of information in the catalog that's very useful to us. And then this final layout, kind of similar to what we had before, but just showing some other bits and pieces. Okay. Now, nodes and editors, how do these work? Katana has the ability for you to render one thing, view one thing, edit one thing, and select one thing. So you have lots of different states in which a node can be in. So you can see here we've got these two arrows going to two different places. On the node on the top has that green circle rather, and that is indicating that the node's parameters are being edited in the parameters tab. So you can see that that particular node is being shown in the parameters tab on the top right hand side. And then at the bottom you have the purple highlight on that node right at the very bottom, and that is showing the node being viewed in the scene graph. And you can see there the screen graph is kind of open to that extent. So if, for instance, I highlighted, if I just move to this slide for a moment, if I highlighted the purple box on a node much further up the tree, to say I went up and chose, say, the camera and selected the purple box on the camera node, the information in the scene graph would change and it would only show us the information regarding the camera. If I came down a bit further, two nodes down to that merge node that you can see there are those three lines coming into, and selected the purple box there, the scene graph will get much bigger because we now have the camera information, the material information, and the geometry information. So that scene graph is very much going to change depending on which node you have highlighted and where that highlight is taking place. Okay, so on this graphic, just to make it very clear, purple is the node being viewed in the scene graph, and you can move your mouse over a node and just press the hotkey V to get that to work. And then you can also use the green parameter, which loads the parameters of that node into the parameters panel, and you can do that with the hotkey E. Okay, we'll get into all of the hotkeys and things as we get into things next week. Now, working with scene assets, projects are normally started by obviously bringing in the assets you require, and this can be various types of assets as we've talked about. They are predominantly done using four methods. You could create primitives, just like we can inside of Maya, spheres, cubes, etc. You can use a limbic in, and this was the method that I've been using most of all, and you can basically save out your limbic cache from Maya, from Houdini, from whatever you're using, and that can be brought in to Katana. And then you can also use the scene graph XML. We're not going to be getting into that in this particular course, but maybe later in a future course we're going to look at that in more detail. That is definitely a little bit more complicated because you're basically writing custom XML scripts at that point. And you can also use what's called the Importomatic, which is something else entirely, but enables you to bring in geometry as well. Okay, now some studios, as it says at the note at the bottom, may have their own geometry formats, and therefore they would be writing their own custom nodes to bring that data into Katana. And like Nuke, Katana is extremely flexible to be able to do anything like that that you may require. Now, on top of assets, we can also deal with UVs, and we're primarily able to view UVs. So you can see here we've got the UV editor and then the viewer over on the right hand side, and the UV editor enables you to examine the UVs and do various bits and pieces. in actually doing UV editing itself in the way that you might think of it in Maya really isn't something that you're going to be doing in Katana. Instead, you're going to want to do that back in Maya or back in 3ds Max or whatever you're using. But you do have a UV editor, so you can at least see what's going on to some kind of degree. But again, if you're going to do full UV editing, you want to be back in your main 3D program to do that. Katana also has animation, and almost any attribute or many of the attributes in Katana can be animated, and you can set keyframes and do various things. You can also, which is great, use expressions throughout, which obviously makes life very powerful and straightforward to do many more complicated tasks. And the two main editors that you're going to be using for working with your animation are obviously the graph editor that we talked about earlier and the dope sheet. And as you can see here, they look very similar to what you have been used to in other 3D tools or in other compositing tools that give you animation flexibility. Okay, but you do have some limitations. So we have a timeline, and the timeline obviously has the ability to move forward and back in time, etc. However, you cannot play an actual scene in Katana. So like in Maya, you would bring in some animation, hit play, and it just plays through loops, loops, loops. In Katana, there is no play button. The concept of hitting play and watching your animation does not exist. You can, however, move forward and back from the current frame, and you can do that based on a certain number of frames. So you could say move forward and back 10 frames, 100 frames, 2 frames, or 1 frame at a time. And you can also jump forward and back between keyframes. But this isn't going to be the place where you can just watch an animation like you can inside of Maya. Now, the final thing to talk about is the manipulation of attributes. And at its core, Katana is a way of really creating and manipulating attributes. And this comes down to the whole recipe idea. It's basically a recipe of information, or a bunch of nodes that are controlled, changed, manipulated, and then at the end of the day, once all those have been set, the render then is spat out. So almost all the nodes can be manipulated in some way or another via the attributes or other methods. And if you want to, you can basically directly influence the attributes of one or more locations using various attributes, scripts or sets, which again give much more flexibility, but again are going to a greater level of complexity, and something that we probably won't be getting into in this particular course. So that is my overview of Katana. Hopefully that has really helped you to understand how Katana thinks, what it's designed to do, how we're going to be using it, and what the flexibility we have to do our look development and lighting. And the flexibility is massive. So next week, as I said, we're going to do a Katana script start to finish. To me, it feels like you're probably at this point gagging to get in and start doing something. And it would be very easy to go in step by step now, going through different elements, and you potentially could get frustrated because you want to see the whole picture quickly. So that's what we're doing next week. The whole picture, class 2, all in one go, assets in, textured, lit, rendered, into Nuke, job done. And then from week 3 onwards, we're going to start breaking down this complexity into bite-sized chunks that we can get our head around. So looking forward to the next few weeks, next few months, and any questions that you have, please put them in the forums. There's probably lots of questions. Please expect me at some points to say this is going to come in week 5 or week 9 or week 3. Please wait, and I will cover that in more detail. But obviously, let your questions flow. Anything that you're thinking about, just heard about, please put it in there and I'll get to it, and we can start the discussions. So until next week, as always, this has been Matt Leonard for FX PhD.